welcome everyone. My name's Tom Pegram. I'm the Deputy Director of the Global Governance Institute. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's really great to have you all here for this public panel event on perhaps one of the most pressing and important questions of our times. Is economic growth essential to human prosperity and well-being? And this event follows on from a workshop which we hosted earlier today on sustainable prosperity and pathways beyond growth, and is in collaboration with the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources. So the workshop discussion was indeed fascinating, sobering, challenging, and it looks as though there aren't really any easy answers. Indeed, that is perhaps why it's such an exciting time to be engaging on these questions around planetary economics, well-being, and planetary limits, or limits to growth. Many of the concepts, the assumptions, the goals, which we've taken for granted in our economies, are now subject to intense debate. And this is perhaps best captured in the very lively discussion on varieties of growth: degrowth, green growth, post-growth. However, what does this discussion really mean concretely for navigating policy transition pathways as we face up to limits to growth? So to help us navigate this terrain, we've got four stellar panelists with us this evening, all leading experts in this area. And I'll do introductions now, and by necessity, keep them fairly brief. So first, we're going to hear from Professor Peter Victor, who joins us from York University in Canada. Peter is Professor Emeritus of Environmental Studies. Peter will be followed by Professor Henrietta Moore, founder and director of the Institute for Global Prosperity and chair in Culture, Philosophy and Design here at University College London. We'll then hear from Dr. Milena Büchs, who is an associate professor in sustainability and economics and low carbon transitions at the University of Leeds. And to round off our panel discussion, we'll have Professor Paul Ekins, who is Professor of Resources and Environmental Policy here at UCL and Director of the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources. So thank you so much to our panelists for joining us throughout today. I'm really delighted that we can host this conversation. Our panelists will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A and dialogue. Please do use the Q&A feature in the Zoom platform to raise your questions. I'll do my best to field them. And okay, without further ado, please, Peter, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to share my screen now. With a bit of luck. Good evening, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be participating in this public panel. I decided for my opening remarks, which probably won't take 10 minutes, but you never know, to try to answer the three questions that are in the program of the event. I call them easy questions in the sense that they're easy to ask, but they're difficult to answer. And so I will give you my answers to the questions in fairly short form, and hopefully we'll be able to engage in discussion about their adequacy as the evening proceeds. So the easy questions: is economic growth essential for human well-being? Can it be reconciled with environmental sustainability? Or do the converging ecological crises we're now facing, from climate change to biodiversity collapse, compel us to rethink the imperative of economic growth? When I was trained to give professional evidence in tribunals many years ago, the lawyer said, always give your summary answer first. So I will do that. No, economic growth is not essential for human well-being. Can it be reconciled with environmental sustainability? No. Do the converging ecological crises we are now facing, from climate change to biodiversity collapse, compel us to rethink the imperative of economic growth? I answer yes to that. So I will now try to flesh out these answers somewhat, the difficult answers as they are. Well, first of all, GDP, as everybody, I think, who follows this at all, knows that it is not itself a measure of human well-being. It's it can be calculated in different ways. One way is to think of it as the total amount of money in an economy spent on final goods and services. So you don't count the intermediate goods and services which go into the production of the final product. You don't count the flour that the baker uses as well as the value of the bread. You just count the value of the bread. It includes everything that's bought and sold legally through the market. Some countries include versions of illegal trade as well, but it doesn't make any distinction in terms of who's buying what, who's consuming what. In other words, distribution is completely ignored. Environmental damages done by consuming and producing all the stuff that's measured in GDP is not included. There are many, many other problems with, and there are things that are included that clearly don't add to well-being and don't act as an indicator of it. But it was never invented and never intended to be a measure of human well-being. So the question then is, do we need continued growth in GDP to advance human well-being? And I think the answer to that is no. The reason being, and this is somewhat evidence-based, that beyond certain thresholds, GDP increase, and that's what I'm meaning by economic growth, because that's the conventional way in which it's measured and thought about. Plenty of evidence that beyond certain thresholds, economic growth does not increase human well-being. And that can be because there's only so much food that you can eat. Some personal mobility is very important, but private airplanes and super yachts don't add to your well-being, except maybe in comparison with other people equally well off. And so this is really important because it means that we can, if we choose, concentrate on what does contribute to human well-being and set aside a consideration of GDP, which really was one of the things that I think came up in our workshop this morning, about which there was quite a lot of agreement. My friend and colleague Herman Daly, who's written so much about the steady state economy over here in North America, has made a lot of use of the term uneconomic growth. So he's reinterpreting the word economic here, but what he's basically saying is something is really only economic in a genuine sense of that term if it adds more to benefits than it does to costs. And he has observed over decades now, with a number of ways of measuring this, that the increase in GDP, in many instances, many cases, many countries now, you find that the extra costs, particularly environmental and social costs, outweigh the increased benefits from GDP. In my own work, I've done computer simulations of real economies, in particular the Canadian economy, but it's the same method has been applied to a couple of European economies, or maybe even more than that. And the simulations show that, well, human well-being can be increased without economic growth. Now, this isn't to be interpreted as saying, therefore, let's deliberately stop the economy growing and it will automatically increase human well-being. That's not what's intended here. The purpose of these simulations was to show that actually you don't need economic growth to advance human well-being, and that by placing too much emphasis on the pursuit of economic growth, it can often reduce human well-being. So it was an attempt, and is an attempt, to show that a modern economy doesn't have to grow in the conventional sense for human well-being to be improved. But that's not to be interpreted, I say it a second time because it often happens this way, that there's a policy recommendation out there that will stop the economy growing and somehow human well-being will be increased. That's not what's said there. The second question, can economic growth be reconciled with environmental sustainability? I answer no to that. I say it from this point of view. We talk about the sources of all of the things that are used in the economy, all the material and energy has to come from somewhere. And materials and energy don't stay long in the economy at all and are disposed of as waste that have to go somewhere. And we call those sinks. Sources and sinks are limited, other than solar energy, of course, but the materials required to capture the solar energy are definitely limited because they're all contained on planet Earth, or they're not available at all. and they're being overexploited. We are in what's now quite commonly called overshoot. We are overusing the capacity of the biosphere to regenerate itself. And I think there was a lot of agreement this morning on that, which was very encouraging. Now, some say that we can get out of this by continuing to expand the economy in terms of expanding GDP, at the same time as reducing less and less materials and energy, which is what we mean by absolute decoupling. I don't see how anybody can believe that that's a viable long-term strategy, because what it means is that GDP grows indefinitely and the materials and energy required for that GDP on a per pound basis decline indefinitely. And it's just not credible. And so it may be a short-term opportunity, but it's certainly not a long-term approach. But even if we had absolute decoupling of flows, it can be insufficient to decouple stocks from GDP. Let me give you an example. We have deforestation is a major problem. We can reduce deforestation, but until it's reduced to zero, we're going to find the stock of the forest declining. And it's the same with climate change. We can reduce the inflow of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, but as long as they remain positive, we're going to be increasing the concentration of greenhouse gases. So we have to really switch our emphasis to decoupling stocks from GDP, not flows, and that's a much tougher thing to do. So the third question, do the converging ecological crises we are now facing, from climate change to biodiversity collapse, compel us to rethink the imperative of economic growth? Yes, definitely. But I want to say one thing, that the imperative of economic growth should be distinguished from its feasibility and desirability. There are kind of three different debates. The feasibility is what I've challenged. Desirability, well, that's a somewhat different debate. If we could have it with no other bad consequences, I suppose it would be desirable. But there's a question about the imperative of economic growth. Do we have an economic system, capitalism, that requires economic growth, and not just requires it, but forces it on us, on our institutions? This is a very important issue. So there are many imperatives of economic growth inherent in capitalism that have been pointed to: accumulation of capital, seeking after profits. There's debate about whether you can have the kind of banking system we've got without expanding the economy to repay the interest, and so on. So I'm just going to move everyone's faces out of my way because I can't see what's next on my. Sorry. So that's all I want to say about the imperatives of growth that are inherent in capitalism. Creates big problems for those of us who see some version of post-growth as the future we should be seeking. Fortunately, the rethinking of the imperatives of growth is well underway. And it raises, I should say, questions that go beyond the normal scope of debates about policy and alternative to questions and discussion of post-capitalism. So here's a little picture which may help frame the discussion of post-capitalism. Here we have time. Here we have the physical size of the economy. I've talked about GDP, but what really matters is shrinking the physical size of the economy, the amount of materials and energy it uses, the land it occupies, and so on. For a while, we were below planetary boundaries in the growth era. We've now entered the era of overshoot, where we're beyond the planetary boundaries, which can actually deplete these planetary boundaries, meaning that we are now tightening the framework within which we have to find sustainability. So we're into, if some would say, a period of degrowth. If we're going to come out of this, we have to bring this curve down and eventually enter a post-growth era where the physical size of the economy is below the planetary boundaries. That's got to be our longer term objective. Now, as I said, many people are working on this in different ways. So we've got here the donut economy, we've got the steady state economy from Herman Daly, we've got from the McCarthy Foundation, the circular economy from Latin America, we've got Buen Vivir. Down here we've got John Fullerton's regenerative economy. Of course, we have degrowth, which is not just an intellectual pursuit, but it's also a movement. We've got here the wellbeing economy, and we've got eco-socialism, which also brings in a much stronger political element than some of the others. So I'm going to just close with one aspect of a post-growth economy that particularly appeals to me, because I'm not very good at this. and it's the finding a better work-life balance. I've never been so busy as when I retired. That's all my own doing. So that's just something I have to somehow come to terms with. But a better work-life balance, which many people have thought about and experienced during the pandemic, have led them to think about how to have a more fulfilling life by spending more time together with family and friends, and doing more for ourselves. There are many more things to say about post-growth, but I'm sure I've used up my time, so I'm going to stop at this point. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Peter. That was a very helpful framing to open up this discussion, really flagging the importance of interrogating the concepts and the goals and their biophysical implications and sort of the content within. Brilliant. Okay, if I could now invite Professor Henrietta Moore to give her remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, and good evening, everyone, and wonderful to be with you. So just picking up then on a few points really that Peter has made, and perhaps approaching them from a slightly different angle. I think trying to work out how to build an economy that works for people and planet is a challenge. As he said, it's widely accepted that the pursuit of growth for growth's sake has led to extractive economies which have wreaked havoc on planet and on people, and whose widespread and acknowledged dissatisfaction with GDP growth as a measure of economic performance, precisely because it tells us nothing about distribution or environmental impacts. And in an era when the largest challenges we face are inequality and climate change and biodiversity loss, this is not just foolhardy, it's actually dangerous. So continuing to focus on GDP growth and sticking with current economic models could and will, I think, entail a certain kind of lock-in. That's a maladaptation, set of missed opportunities. It means that we are in danger of locking ourselves into legacy problems and approaches, which are going to turn out to be very dysfunctional in the future, and in fact impede our ability to transform our economic systems further. So to tackle the most pressing challenges, and to deliver sustainable and shared prosperity, we need a new paradigm and new metrics that enable us to chart where we're going and how we're going to get there. And only in this way can we really tell if our economy is going to be in the service of life for people and planet. So retargeting the economy towards human and planetary flourishing does not just mean revising the established metrics, but it also means changing our priorities and providing new types of solutions. Now, to date, a recurring concern in public and policy debates, which is really what this event is about, is how to achieve higher growth rates and what the cost to GDP would be if we tackled inequality and climate change. And these questions continue to overshadow the rather more obvious ones about what would be the cost to people and planet of not addressing these challenges. It's just very interesting that language is always about what will be the impact on GDP. Most importantly, this kind of discussion, as I said earlier today, keeps the debate very much centered around growth, promoting what we might call a let's tinker with the GDP approach, while ignoring the more critical question, which Peter perhaps directed us towards, of what growth are we envisaging in our economies, if any, and for what purpose? So what are we growing, and whether that contributes to building a shared, sustainable and prosperous future matters more than knowing whether we grow or not and by how much. Because our aim is to assure improvement in the well-being of the people and the planet, and not just have pursuit of growth for growth's sake. So going beyond growth, I suggest, does not only mean abandoning a fixation with GDP and the relentless pursuit of economic growth, but it also means relinquishing some ideas that are behind them. And those ideas are not just the idea of growth, but the idea of efficiency, maximization, and extraction. And it means relinquishing the way we think of efficiency, maximization, and extraction as the lens through which we see and frame prosperity, sustainability, and flourishing. So that's really the emotional and intellectual problem put together. Shifting attention away from economic growth as the primary goal of our economies will also, I think, require the adoption of place-based whole system approaches. So GDP is a statistical aggregate focused solely on monetary transactions that can be measured in the same way in every country. However, social and ecological systems evolve together rather than in isolation. Social and economic problems are context dependent, and all societies have their own understanding of the good life, where they would like to go. So placing greater emphasis on what really matters to people in the places on the planet in which they live requires thinking about systems, food, water, soil, air, transport, waste, as Peter suggested, as interconnecting. And it also therefore requires us to attend to diversity and local specificities. So as we all know, Wales is not Nigeria. It also requires taking into account people's voices, since reimagining prosperity automatically raises questions of what counts as prosperity, when, where, and for whom. Defining and measuring prosperity and quality of life together with communities for the communities is the backbone of much of the work that I have been doing with the IGP and the development of what we call the Prosperity Index. And what the Prosperity Index offers is a place-based whole systems approach, bringing together, it's not just a metric, it's a way of bringing together various organizations, businesses, policymakers, and groups of people to co-produce solutions and track progress at the local level in a way that better reflects and captures the lived experiences of people and charts specific transformation pathways. Most importantly, the Prosperity Index can be used to measure the success of existing initiatives where solutions are already emerging, as for instance, in the case of the Wild Ennerdale project in the Lake District in the UK. So this is a partnership of people and local businesses and organizations and local government seeking to naturally regenerate the Ennerdale Valley by investing in long-term and sustainable environmental and tourism practices and reconnecting the landscape to natural processes, planting native woodlands to lock up carbon, creating healthier, more resilient soils, and reducing flooding. And the project has created sustainable business opportunities and protected the history and cultural heritage of Ennerdale, allowing greater public enjoyment of the natural landscape and also supporting local livelihoods. So challenges like climate change and biodiversity loss are inherently global, and as such, of course, they require collective action from all of us and metrics capable of enabling international monitoring. However, they also require metrics that measure things that matter to people, that people can relate to, and that can tell us, or tell us, our communities, if our own actions are contributing to, or instead posing a threat to, human and planetary flourishing. And a redefined prosperity oriented towards quality of life and planetary regeneration has to engage with the assets communities have and what they can contribute towards solutions and outcomes. So following a citizen-led approach rather than a top-down one will empower people, help increase the legitimacy of the metrics created, increase social solidarity and social cohesion, and ultimately increase the impact of these metrics on policy, which will help us to achieve the objectives that we have set, for example, trying to reach our net zero ambitions. So we need to recognize that the locus for achieving prosperity is simultaneously global, national, and local, but that perhaps we have been undervaluing, I suggest, and neglecting the local, figuring that all the real action is either national or individual, like your carbon footprint or what the government will do. Redefining prosperity and developing new measures needs to be underpinned by norms and values that tell us what our objectives are. And of course, it's ultimately these norms and values that should drive our actions. But this does not tell us which values and norms exactly should we base our actions and measures on. And new measures of prosperity must be centered on the principle of equity and the erasure of systemic injustice. And they need to be transparent, relevant, and inclusive. And in order to do this, they need to take account of the lives people lead, their lived experience. So a redefined prosperity should not be the privilege of a few, but a founding characteristic of the social. Reframing the economy in terms of values shifts the narrative on the purpose of the economy, making knowledge accessible and available to everyone. We need to bring people's voices into this policy making, this transition that we want, whether we term it, growth, post-growth, whatever, growth, whatever we call it. We need to bring people's voices into this policy making. We need to increase democratic participation and social inclusion. And only then, I think, will we have laid the foundations of a global economy that works for people and the planet. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Henrietta, for a very rich reflection. At the macro level, it's not just about abandoning economic growth, but also relinquishing some of the practices and the goals which accompany it. And then, of course, the micro, the importance of the lived experience, as you put it, and the pitfalls of any kind of imposed one-size-fits-all kind of policy design. So thanks so much. Next, I'm delighted to give the floor to Dr. Milena Büchs. Please, Milena.
Many thanks, Tom. Thank you so much for the invitation, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's exciting to have this discussion with you. I am also going to share my screen. If I can find my slides, that means. Oh, excuse me, for some reason, I'm ever so sorry. Something isn't quite right because I can't see my own slides on the window. That's a bit disconcerting. I never had that before. Sorry. Let me see. What can I do? They are here. Share screen. Yeah. Oh, here they are. Okay. Don't know what happened there. Excuse me. Right. Okay. Little wobble there. Hopefully, that's just bad luck at the start. Okay, so I wanted to sort of indirectly also, I guess, talk to the three questions, directly and indirectly talk to the three questions that Tom and the organizers have posed for this panel. So the first one, I guess, actually speaks to the second question about can we reconcile growth with environmental, decoupling it from environmental impact? Because this is one of the main arguments for post-growth, and Peter has already talked about this, that currently there's very little evidence for absolute decoupling of environmental impacts and emissions at the global level. So, for example, on this graph here, where I have indexed GDP growth, which is the red line with emissions and also the material footprint, we can clearly see that what is happening is relative decoupling. So basically things get more efficient. We emit less CO2 per dollar globally, but obviously globally emissions in the material footprint have still been increasing, certainly up until the COVID-19 pandemic, and emissions are picking up again now. So what we need is, of course, absolute decoupling. So emissions, for example, would need to decrease. I think the IPCC, for example, recommends that global emissions need to peak by 2025 if we want to stay within the global carbon budget and stay within 1.5 degrees of global heating. So this is not happening at the moment. There are individual countries where absolute decoupling has occurred for brief periods, but not at the pace that is required. So this is sort of one main, I think, argument, ecological argument for post-growth. There are other arguments as well in terms of can we actually achieve growth in the future? It's obviously very, very difficult to predict the future, and I'm definitely not claiming that we can do that. But people like Robert Gordon, for example, have suggested that there are a range of headwinds to economic growth that are actually inherent in the current economic system and also social systems. So due to demographic change, for example, and the expansion of the elderly population, or the growing proportion of the elderly population in the population, that sort of contributes to a slowdown of productivity growth, for example. And a number of other sort of economic issues that we have around actually stimulating growth at the moment, we will highly likely see sort of long-term impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic as well, and also from the ongoing Ukraine war. So in other words, we can't actually necessarily rely on high growth rates in the future, and therefore it could be prudent for governments and societies on the whole to actually think about how we can manage without growth. Another problem is that so growth is obviously related to profit maximization, but profit maximization often does not incentivize the actions that are in the collective interest. So for example, social or ecological goals. So just as an example, when oil and gas prices are rising, it becomes less profitable to actually invest into renewable energy, or it is just simply not profitable for private companies to invest into expanding public transport infrastructure in areas where this is difficult to achieve, like less densely populated areas, even though this might be socially desirable. So these are just some, reasons. Peter has given us a lot more detail here as well for the argument. So sorry, these are some of the good arguments, I think, for post-growth. There are some concerns, of course, and they often relate to well-being and welfare. And this is what I want to come back to in a moment. So the alternative that is being proposed is that we can prioritize, instead of economic growth, social and ecological objectives in policy making, but also at the organizational level, so also in economics. So businesses would have to prioritize social and ecological objectives as well, instead of maximizing profits. The aim would be really to achieve need satisfaction for everyone within planetary boundaries. This is very much inspired by Kate Raworth's donut here, but as Peter also has said earlier, there are a range of other thinkers that have argued on very similar lines. So coming on to the challenges then in terms of moving towards post-growth. And here I want to focus on the relationship between growth and welfare more specifically, and suggest that at the moment, what the situation that we experience at the moment is a mutual dependency between growth and welfare. So at the moment, welfare states depend on economic growth for a range of reasons. So welfare spending, for example, is financed through taxes on income and consumption, and also through social insurance contributions, which are dependent on economic growth, in the sense that they rise when we have economic growth, and they fall when growth rates are negative. Also, the concern is, of course, that when we have an economic crisis, then unemployment would be rising, and at the same time, government revenues would be shrinking, right at the time when the demand for welfare services and benefits is actually increasing. Another concern is that when we have economic crises, that could actually increase inequality. So Piketty's theory here is that if the growth rate is lower than the return on capital, then we would see increasing inequality. And finally, we have aging societies in many countries around the world, and that increases the demand for pensions and healthcare. Some argue that this actually requires future growth so that we can meet that additional demand. So the flip side of that is that welfare states actually support growth at the moment. So welfare states, as we know them, have evolved in the post-World War II era, when growth was, we had high growth rates in the economy. And so they're designed to support growth. Just to give you a few examples, so welfare states, for example, improve education and health of the population. That actually increases productivity and therefore, of course, contributes to economic growth. Welfare states also stabilize consumer demand during economic crises. So they, increase benefit payments for people who are in unemployment or fall below the poverty line during economic crises. But that is actually partly also in the interest of the economy, because, like I said, it stabilizes consumer demand and hence keeps the economy going. And welfare states, in a more general way, contribute to social peace and economic stability because they minimize or at least reduce social conflict. So negotiations between trade unions and employers, for example, have contributed to that in the post-World War II era. So this is a conundrum that we're facing at the moment, it seems, that we have that mutual dependency between growth and welfare. So, however, I think there are a few things that we can think about and that we can do to actually decouple growth and welfare. So, first of all, of course, we would need to design welfare states and welfare policies so that they don't primarily aim at supporting growth, but actually to achieve environmental and social objectives more directly. So a range of policy proposals have been made here. Universal basic services. I've been hoping that Henrietta might have talked about this, and universal basic income, working time reduction, and a range of other proposals that have been made in the literature that relates to this. So moving away, from the aim to actually support growth, I think that will be the first step. Then we need to obviously think about how can we finance welfare states without growth. So we could think about alternative revenue streams for welfare states. One could be to move more towards taxes on wealth. Taxes on wealth might be less dependent on economic growth because assets are stocks and are hence less dependent on economic growth. Their market value might change, but taxes could, I think, potentially be designed in a way that they have a sort of fixed component for the size of the asset, which doesn't necessarily change with the market value of that asset. And we could also repurpose state expenditure and spending more generally. Paul corrected me here when I said in the previous panel that this is all just state expenditure. But basically, the IMF has estimated that globally around 7% of GDP is currently being spent on direct and indirect fossil fuel subsidies. So that does include things like expenditure for health impacts of air pollution, for example, or other environmental damage. But basically, the idea is that currently we do spend a lot of resources on fixing environmental problems, on social problems, and if we could repurpose this spending to more directly achieve well-being and redistribution, then we would already gain a lot. And more fundamentally, I think it's important to think about transforming the economy such that there is less of a need for welfare spending in the first place. So why do we need welfare spending at the moment? Because growth is partly, at least, contributing to the need for spending, because it creates inequality, it creates economic insecurity, it creates a range of health problems, partly related to the environment, of course, not even to mention impacts of climate change that we then also need to respond to. So if we can organize our economies in ways that redistribute or distribute resources and power more evenly in the first place, and also in a way that decouples paid work from welfare, that could reduce the need for welfare spending in the first place. So I wanted to say a few words, if I have a couple more minutes, on governance as well, because that was certainly a topic for the workshops as well. And I think it has popped up in many of the discussions that we had this afternoon. So I wanted to emphasize that I think democratic governance is absolutely key for the transition towards post-growth. And this relates both to the state and the economy more broadly. So I think we need to democratize the state and the economy equally. An example could be that things like deliberative forums could be used for citizens to engage with each other and also to define needs at the local level. Because if that is done top down, this would be, unacceptable, I think, to many people, and would not actually deliver the actions that then respond to need satisfaction very well. I also very much like the proposal which came from the Foundational Economy Collective in Manchester, who say that we should actually define social and ecological duties of corporations in the Constitution. So that I mentioned this here under democratization, because I think it basically means that we integrate, or we would then integrate, economic actions and decision making within companies actually into a political framework, and sort of to spell out these social and ecological duties that businesses would have would be an important step to achieve that. And one example where democratization or democratic governance has already been discussed in the literature as well is actually universal basic services. So this idea that we can provide collective services free at the point of use to everyone in society, which already exist in health and social care and education. And we could expand this to provide energy, transport, water, internet, and so on. Like I said, Henrietta would be much better placed than me to talk about this. But the idea is brilliant, I think. One concern that has been raised in relation to universal basic services is that, again, because they're collectively provided, often publicly provided, that there could be a sort of top-down, autocratic type provision. But I don't think this is necessarily the case. So service provision could be designed in a democratic way, with community input to defining needs, to use user feedback and collaboration in service provision, and of course by making service provision democratically accountable in the first place. So I would like to end on these notes, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
I'm not sure who's going to say something. Tom, you're muted.
I think we've lost Tom, haven't we, somewhere?
Oh, we've lost him, have we?
Well, yes, he's back. He's back.
Sorry about that. I'm having some technical problems. Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can now.
Yeah, I caught most of that. So thank you, Milena. Very interesting insights into, I think, some of the macro drivers which might be already tilting our economic structures towards a reckoning with post-growth. And then, of course, the question becomes, well, what can be done to bend rather than break those structures as we navigate this transition? So yeah, fantastic. Okay, so to bring us to the discussion part of this evening, I'm delighted to invite Professor Paul Ekins to give his remarks. Paul, please. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tom, and thanks for inviting me, and it's great to be discussing these issues. I'd like to start with the second of your three questions, which is about the environment, environmental sustainability, a global economy that works for the planet, because if it doesn't work for the planet, it's not going to work for people, and we're not going to have much of a GDP or anything else coming down the track. And I want to start with what I think we need to do. This is what my research is focused on in order to sort out some of these ecological and planetary environmental issues. And I think it's pretty clear what we need to do. We need to decarbonize. We need to stop biodiversity loss. We need to regenerate nature. We need to dramatically reduce pollution across a whole range of issues. And generally, we need both to define the safe operating space within which humanity needs to live, and then we need to put in place the policies to get there. We know quite a lot about what we need to do. So we need to have a huge program of investment in renewable energy, in energy efficiency in buildings, in batteries, in hydrogen. We need to get rid of fossil fuels as quickly as possible. We need to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. We need an agricultural revolution that regenerates nature as well as feeding people. We need to invest in electrically powered public transport in cities, and we need to make them largely car-free. We need the industrial transformation of energy-intensive sectors. We need to move to green steel, green cement or substitutes for it, the green mining of minerals for the energy transition. And we need to design for circularity so that we make much better use of the materials that we win from the earth. We need longer warranties on products. We need rights to repair. We need producer responsibility and ownership. And across the environment generally, we need to reduce what I've called the sustainability gap and move into the safe operating space. So that's the environmental imperative, which for me absolutely trumps any kind of growth imperative. But the question then, which is very interesting to an economist, and I think to anybody else, is let's say we did this and there are moves towards doing that in all sorts of places. What would happen to the economy? Would it grow or would it not? And I think the honest answer to that is we don't know, because we've never been there and our models are absolutely not fit to answer that question. But there are clues. On the plus side, we would unleash an enormous amount of investment and of innovation to do all that. And the growth theory that I know suggests that actually growth comes from investment and innovation. And I see very little reason for thinking that this kind of investment and innovation will be any different. On the minus side, initially at least, food and materials would become more expensive as we start taking account of the full environmental costs of producing them. That innovation may be able to bring down those costs, but initially we would be paying much more for minerals and probably more for food as well if we were producing it with nature instead of against it. Interestingly, for energy, that is no longer true. It would certainly have been true 15 years ago, but we've gone through that cycle of huge innovation in energy so that renewable energy is now more or less competitive with fossil fuels in many countries of the world. And if we look at the macroeconomic models that accompany IPCC reports, we can find that indeed we can decarbonize at the kind of rates that we need to decarbonize without excessively negative impacts on economic growth. Certainly, economies in those models keep growing. And the one thing we can be absolutely sure of, that growth and indeed GDP will be higher under that kind of scenario than if we go on trashing the planet. And we need to be really clear about that. We can also say that the share of investment in the economy will be higher than it is now. And that means that the share of consumption will be lower. That will be politically challenging in a society that describes itself as a consumer society. And if GDP is also decreasing, then not only is the consumption share going to be lower, but absolute consumption will be much lower, and that will be even more politically challenging. Now, if we engage in that kind of environmental program, I very much hope we would get GDP growth, because if we were to get GDP growth, that would make it much easier to provide the basic services that Milena is talking about and to reduce inequality. And that is the second part really of this talk, looking at the inequality, which Henrietta, I think quite rightly said, it's the second big issue facing human societies today. We know that markets create inequality. They're meant to do that. That's markets working properly. They take resources from people who are, quote, less efficient, and they give them to people who are, quote, more efficient. That's what they do. The question then is, what do we do about it? What do governments do about it? Because it is governments that need to do something about it. And of course, Peter's quite right in that of itself, growth will not reduce inequality. It will only reduce inequality in a market-based society if governments decide that's what they want to do. And most market participants who win from markets don't want governments to do very much. They think it is fair and just if they've won in markets, but they should keep what they've won in markets. And societies often seem to agree with that because they elect conservative governments which broadly operate on that principle. And in this country, in the UK, we've had a conservative government now since 2010, and that is exactly how it's operated. And there's a very good article by John Harris in The Guardian today, actually, which lists in great detail the policies of the Conservative government over the last 12 years that have actually increased inequality, absolutely deliberately, by reducing the redistributive element in the economy. I don't approve of that, but that's a political and ideological statement. But for those who don't approve of that, we know what to do broadly in order to reduce inequality. We've got the ideas of universal basic services, the great reform following the Second World War that gave us free health services, for example. We've got benefit systems currently expressed in universal credit, which I don't think is a particularly good reform, but nevertheless, it is there and it can be increased. And indeed, it was increased during the COVID pandemic. We can reskill and retrain as workers move from carbon intensive to non-carbon intensive industries. We can invest in deprived areas. We can regenerate deprived areas, and we can capture taxation from that regeneration through a land value tax. And it was fabulous to see that The Guardian had a leader the other day recommending a land value tax, which is something that I've always been entirely in favor of. We can even control rents in order to make housing affordable in cities where it is not so. We know how to do this, but it's a political choice whether we do it or not. And so far, we haven't been doing it over the last 12 years. The question then is, if we did do it, what would that do to economic growth? Well, the traditional neoclassical answer to that question is that it would reduce growth because it would put off all the animal spirits of entrepreneurs who want to make stacks of money. I'm doubtful about that because I think there is an enormous wastage of human capital in the deprived areas at the moment. People who could be skilled and talented and useful and productive and live much better lives for themselves, who incidentally would also be much more productive economically. They would be healthier, they'd be better fed, they'd be better educated, and that would be good for the economy as well as obviously good for their well-being. So my question then is, why would such a program not generate economic growth? And I would very much hope that we could start arguing that it might. And just some final comments on well-being, which, I mean, clearly no one can be against people increasing their well-being. Peter said that it was established that private planes and super yachts don't increase people's well-being. I don't think he owns a private plane or a super yacht, but I may be wrong about that. But certainly the people who do think it does increase their well-being. And I remember very clearly when Bill Gates was publishing his book on climate change, and he explicitly defended his private plane and said he simply couldn't imagine life without it, and he was offsetting the carbon emissions busily from it, which of course is a scam and is unlikely to do anything to reduce carbon emissions. But you can see that confronted with that basic contradiction in his own lifestyle, nevertheless, the private plane meant so much to him that he was not prepared to give it up. So I think we have to be very careful telling people what, telling other people what increases their well-being and not. And just a final personal remark, as I'm working at home, I'm not today, but as I am, I look out of my little flat window into a leafy street in southwest London, and is lined on both sides by SUVs. Now, no one in London needs to own an SUV. Absolutely nobody needs to own an SUV. And yet these people, they all have them. We know that that is now the biggest selling car in the UK. And presumably they think that this is improving their well-being, because these are not cheap items. And I'm not prepared to tell them that they aren't. I would definitely, if given the democratic mandate, I would definitely ban them from London, because we don't need them. They're an enormous nuisance. They make the place dirty, smelly, and unsafe. And those are very good social reasons for doing without them. But I know that that would be an enormous political struggle to achieve that end. So there we go. Just a few remarks. I hope a bit provocative at the end, so that we can have a good discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul. I always appreciate your clarity on the environmental imperative, and indeed the very concrete practical challenges that we face even in our own postcodes. And crucially, the human social factor and the importance of equity for ensuring a bit of buy-in for transition policies. So we now have 15-20 minutes for Q&A. Initially, I just want to invite our panelists, if there are any sort of rapid fire burning responses that you'd like to provide to one another, please do feel free now to take that opportunity. Perhaps just unmute if you wish.
Well, the only thing I would say is that in the case of the cost of investment, so very often it's not seen as investment, it's seen as a cost. So Paul is very right on the investment thing. But the level of investment, the way that that calculation is done, is very often, in terms of the fiscal constraints that Milena was talking about, it's very often thought of in very short-term consequences, so perhaps 20 years. So what's the cost of the investment over 20 years, and how will that be managed? But actually, of course, if you're regenerating the planet, one of the things you need to do is to push that consideration out by a very long way, because of course, if you're regenerating the planet, there will be benefits which will flow back to future generations. And we have no idea over what time. If we stop polluting all our soils and all our water, I mean, just even the impact on health and everything we know about epigenetics would suggest that we would be out in a horizon of about 100 years for understanding how we depreciate the cost of that investment. So we need to think more clearly about how we use some terms like cost and investment, because some of this debate is when people imagine this is something that has to be paid back tomorrow, right? Or its benefits will flow directly into income tomorrow. So changing that thinking about the economy is actually quite hard to do. People are government treasury is very resistant on that. Look at the way we've come out of the pandemic and started to think about how do we impose new constraints for debt.
Tom?
Peter, yeah, please.
Paul began his speech with a long list of to-dos, things we must do to adequately deal with the full range of environmental crises that we're confronted with. And we agree. And then he talked about this is going to require a lot of investment, and we agree on that. Where we perhaps don't agree, or at least we would have to agree that more needs to be done to find out the answer, is to what extent is the investment that has to be done to deal with environmental problems going to contribute to the growth of the economy? Now, it will contribute on the demand side. It is money being spent in the economy. My concern and my observation, the research I've done on this, suggests that a lot of that green investment will not contribute on the supply side. So for example, with the rising sea level, we expect seawalls to be built in parts of the world that never dreamt they would have to do that, around Manhattan, for example. Well, that protects capital that you've got there, but as of it on its own, it doesn't contribute anything to increase production. So the question then is, and I'm not saying I've got the final answer to this, but I perhaps have a different answer from Paul, is that I think a very significant proportion of the investment required to deal with that long shopping list of things that have to be done will not add to the productive capacity of the economy, and therefore will slow the rate of economic growth very considerably. And that's certainly what my own research has shown. But I do think, I think, because Paul and I have known each other a long time, I would agree that there's plenty of opportunity for further research to get a more definitive answer to that question. But I think the mistake can be made that simply because a lot of investment has to be made to deal with the environmental crisis, it will stimulate growth. That's only on the demand side, not on the supply side.
Thank you, Peter, for clarifying that very interesting fault line. Paul, do you want to respond very briefly?
Yeah, difficult to respond briefly on complex macroeconomic ideas, but yes, I will try. Clearly, that investment has got to be found from somewhere. And I'm not someone who thinks there's a whole bunch of unproductive potential capital lying around in the economy that we can just pick up. Therefore, it will have to be taken from somewhere. It will probably have to be taken from consumption, as I've implied, and that's not going to be either popular or easy. And we then come to the point as to whether this investment allied to innovation will actually, over the medium term, increase the productive power of the economy more than the consumption that is currently taking place. And that will depend entirely on what consumption it is and what consumption is substituted for. As I say, I can't answer that question because I don't think we've done the work. But certainly on the energy side, when I look at the macroeconomic models that have full crowding out, in other words, they assume that the investment in new forms of energy have to come from investment that is already being made into other things. They do slow the growth of the economy slightly, but they do not in any remote way take us into reductions in GDP. So the growth of the economy may fall from 2% a year to 1.8% a year, which, as anyone knows who calculates GDP, is well within the noise of the calculation. So we wouldn't actually notice that anything had happened at all. So that would be my answer to that. But that's just energy. And energy is now one of the least challenging areas, actually, to get the new investment into, because a lot of it is profitable. When we're talking about food and minerals, both of which are associated with enormous environmental impacts, and we would have to absolutely transform the way that we extract those natural resources, then the jury's still out as far as I'm concerned.
Can I make a quick response, Tom? Look, I think if you agree that this investment is going to reduce consumption, you then have to at least acknowledge that that reduced consumption will discourage investment in the sectors of the economy that were planning to produce the output that people would have consumed. That's an additional dampening effect, frankly, that I haven't played into my models. Thank you for that. Secondly, on renewables, I think you're exaggerating the extent to which renewables have changed so much in the last 15 years. Of course, costs have come down, but they still contribute a very small percent of the energy required by modern economies. Here's the rub. The more we now try to get into renewables very quickly, the more the demand for materials is going to rise very rapidly, because these technologies are very materials intensive. That's going to increase the price of materials, and you've already signaled that that's a problem. So I think, Paul, you and I need to have an offline talk and see if we can finally sort these things out for good.
I think it'll take more than an offline talk, Peter. It'll take some serious economic modeling development.
We've done it. Tim Jackson and I, a lot of that. Anyway,
our audience a flavour of the very lively discussions that we've had today.
Yes.
Milena, do you have any very quick response before we move to the audience?
Well, just that climate investments are cheaper than climate disasters, and both are cheaper than the political and social turmoil that's going to result if we do not address these issues. Because look what's happening now. I mean, when we talk about 1.5 degrees above historic level, that already means 4 degrees in the middle of Africa. Okay, so there are parts of Africa now it's just too hot to work outside. So forget about food production or any of that. Right? So more migration, more people moving, more the level of turmoil that we could be facing. So it's not the consequence. Forget about the impacts on GDP. This conversation, when it's framed in those terms, it's important, but the cost of the social and political turmoil that could be coming could be very much greater than either the climate investment or the cost of the climate disaster if we don't make the climate investment.
I absolutely agree with that.
Thank you. Milena, do you have a quick response before I move to the Q&A?
Yeah, I'm happy to pick up on some of the questions in the Q&A, if that's okay.
Okay.
I think there was one directed to myself about modern monetary theory.
Yes, thank you.
And yeah, which is a really interesting question. So thanks for raising it. I sympathize with the suggestion from modern monetary theory that basically at the moment money is created by banks by issuing debt, and the argument is that that actually drives economic growth because we need to service the debt in the future. Service the debt in the future and the interest on the debt. And the alternative suggestion is that governments should instead spend money into the economy. So basically that money creation should be democratized. And the argument against the counter argument that would create inflation is usually to say it would not necessarily create inflation if the spending into the economy actually responds to a demand in the economy. So I sympathize with that argument, but I have to confess that I'm not a monetary theory scholar, so this is why I haven't actually included it into my presentation, but I am aware that this is very much part of the degrowth and post-growth debate. And yeah, I think it's important to follow the development of these arguments. I think the second point that I would really like to touch on quickly, because I think it's a fundamental question, this question about how we should describe human well-being and how we can measure it, because it seems fundamental to this debate, and really highlight that I think what has become really important in the debate is this more objective understanding of well-being from a human needs perspective. So scholars like Doyle and Goff and also Max Neef have very much contributed to this debate. And also in the capabilities discussion, I think you can see similar arguments that we shouldn't just define well-being from a subjective point of view. I think subjective well-being does play a role, because obviously people's perceptions, needs to be considered, and it's important for how societies work, whether we have conflict and so on, for example. But I think what people like Doyle and Goff have suggested is that it's better to define a well-being in terms of human needs. So basically to say there are certain things that every human being should have a right to have. And that goes beyond pure subsistence. So it could be things like autonomy, it can be participation in society. I think that's actually the highest sort of human need that Goff and Doyle have defined. So, and then the idea is that even though at this generic level we can say every human being should have a right to achieve these things, that need satisfiers can vary. So at a local level, and also through history, how exactly we are responding to these needs can vary. But the argument really is that by focusing on needs, it's a sufficiency argument. It's basically the question: what do we need to have enough? What do we, what sort of resources do we need to satisfy sort of our basic requirements? Instead of asking, how much luxury can we afford? Well, you can ask that question, but I think then immediately you have to deal with sort of issues around inequality, and the example that Paul gave, for example, with people enjoying private jets and so on. I'm sure they do, and probably each of us would do. But I think the question is, can we afford to do that in the current circumstances, knowing that well-being is also the well-being of future generations? And so we need to make sure that we don't undermine future generations' ability to satisfy their needs. And I think that is partly what it boils down to.
Great, thank you, Milena. And yes, you very helpfully addressed the first question by Aramid as well.
Yeah, I'm just following, if I may, Tom, just following up on that. I mean, I think Milena gave a very accomplished overview of what's actually a difficult set of discussions. And it's why when I am thinking and writing about things, I very often don't talk about well-being, I talk about quality of life. And the reason for that is because there is an element here that she was attending to of, humans are a species of cooperators. So therefore they need to live in social situations and to be part of those social situations. You know, a lot of the problems we have at the moment are people not feeling they belong in the economy. So addressing those issues cannot be addressed simply by looking at individual well-being, or at any of the sort of aggregate figures that you can get from that. So you do have to attend to this question of what is quality of life for communities in place, exactly as Milena said, because these things vary as well. How do people understand their aspirations, their hope, their quality of life? And that's the basis of the work we've been doing in the Prosperity Index, working with communities to get answers to those kinds of problems. What matters and what would need to change. Including the structural constraints as they experience them. So there is, you know, the whole question of that is there, you know, pollution, etc.
Brilliant, thank you, Henrietta. Yes, and we won't get into the well-being of non-human species.
Not yet. Next time.
Another time, yeah. Great, thank you. Paul, Peter, do you have any response to these specific issues?
Well, I'd like to have a look at the other two questions that I've got there, because they both talk about corporations and businesses, and obviously businesses are pretty important. It's important to recognize where we're coming from in our particular culture, and we are coming from, you know, Milton Friedman and his assertion that businesses were only there to make profits. That was all that was that, and that's been enormously influential, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom. I think less so in mainstream Europe. We're gradually moving away from that. And businesses are moving away from that. And I mean, all the discussion in business at the moment is about purpose and values and all that kind of stuff. A lot of that is, frankly, I think, flim-flam. I mean, it doesn't mean anything. And when I look at what senior executives still pay themselves, it's still very clear that they're very much motivated by money, and they can only pay themselves very large sums of money if their companies make very large profits. And I don't see anything that suggests that shareholders are not also very much motivated by money. But that debate and that discussion at least is changing to the extent that I think it becomes feasible to think of governments putting greater requirements on business. Firstly, to do with transparency, so that companies are required to report more and more things, so that small but nevertheless not totally insignificant proportion of consumers and NGOs that follow these things can make a fuss when it appears that businesses are not doing the right thing. And then, of course, businesses need to be regulated much more strongly than they are at the moment. I mean, they shouldn't be allowed to make profits out of damaging the environment, because what we know is that if you can make a profit out of damaging the environment, there will be a business that will do it, because that's the way the system works. And we, at the moment, don't even bother to pay someone like the Environment Agency enough to have enforcement officers to ensure that businesses obey current regulations, let alone paying, having enough enforcement officers to enforce a whole heap more regulations, which we will need if we are to stop businesses damaging the environment. And I mean, the most obvious example of that is the fact that water companies are still routinely allowed to release sewage into rivers without anybody saying by leave. I mean, the Environment Agency doesn't even monitor most of that stuff. And we've seen the numbers, which are just unbelievably scandalous. So we've got a long, long way to go. But I think that we have at least moved away from the kind of Milton Friedman argument that all businesses need to do is make profits, which becomes completely bankrupt when the business lobbyists not only argue that they need to make profits, but they also need to set the government rules. And we know that businesses have huge influence in doing that. Again, much more probably on the other side of the Atlantic than here, but very much here too. So I think there's an enormous amount to be done there in governance. And that speaks, of course, very much to the last slide that Milena showed us.
Thank you, Paul. Peter, would you have any thoughts?
Well, I'm just going to have a quick statement on a topic that I don't think you wanted us to discuss, and that is the well-being of non-human species. just because I believe that it is a key element in the work of those who work on post-growth, degrowth, managing without growth. Anybody in that with sympathies in those directions is partly there because non-human species have suffered so much at the overshoot that I described in my talk, that we are overusing the biological capacity of the planet, and it's the other species in particular that suffer the most from that, and now we're next in line. So it needs to be on the agenda, but we don't have time to discuss it anymore today.
No, the biomass figures are astounding, no doubt. Okay, well, thank you so much. I think we've covered an awful lot of ground, actually, and it was really a fascinating discussion, and you've all handled our questions so efficiently, so we're very grateful, and I think it's been a real showcase for just how important and vital this conversation is right now. Thank you to all of our audience as well for your questions, for your very lively chat, actually, in the chat function, and for joining us. So look forward to seeing you again at an event very soon. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.